She came in off the street and told the millionaire that she could help his paralyzed son. Everyone laughed, and then something happened that no one expected. Subscribe and write in the comments from where you're watching this video. The winter wind cut through the alleyways like shards of broken glass, hissing past steel trash cans and rusted fire escapes, leaving nothing untouched by its icy sting. Beneath the trembling pulse of a flickering street lamp, a crumpled form stirred inside a patchwork of torn blankets and cardboard sheets. 10-year-old Kiara blinked into the cold and pulled the blanket tighter around her thin shoulders. Her hands, dark and cracked with chill, trembled as she clutched the tattered notebook nestled against her chest like a relic. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and jasmine, the last trace of her grandmother, now buried beneath the ground in silence. This was not the first night Kiara had slept outside, and it wouldn't be the last. Since her mother died, curled against a subway vent, skin bluish, eyes fixed on some place far from this world, Kiara had been alone. The system came looking for her. A clipboard woman with a concerned voice said they could take her somewhere safe. Kiara ran. Safe was a word she'd stopped believing in. Now she lived by the code of the forgotten. Keep moving, stay small, trust no one. But tonight was different. From the pocket of her oversized coat, Kiara pulled out a pencil stub and carefully opened the notebook. The entries inside were jagged, written in childish scrawl and uneven ink, but they were sacred. Her grandmother's words were part spell, part instruction, passed down like secret fire. Pain is not just in flesh, one page read. It sings in the soul, and a healer listens not with ears, but with heart. Kiara touched the page and closed her eyes. She had read that line 100 times, but tonight it pulsed louder. Across the city, music and laughter spilled out of glass towers that reached into the fogged night. One of them belonged to the Wakefield Corporation, a name Kiara had seen printed on a towering billboard just days before. A man in a suit had gazed down from it, his features chiseled and commanding, smiling beside a logo that screamed power and prosperity. Richard Wakefield, healing the world with science. Kiara didn't know who Richard Wakefield was then. She didn't care. But everything changed the moment she saw the boy. It was by chance, or fate, as her grandmother would have said. Kiara had been scrounging behind a high-end clinic's back entrance, hoping to sneak away with leftover sandwiches the night nurse sometimes tossed in the dumpster. A convoy of black vehicles pulled into the garage, polished to a mirror shine, guarded by men in coats with coiled earpieces. A sleek wheelchair rolled out of the central car, followed by a tall man with frost-gray hair and a jawline like steel. His eyes were laser-focused, bored even, as he exchanged words with a doctor. But Kiara saw the boy. He was perhaps 12. Pale skin like paper, ash-blonde hair that fell over a furrowed brow, and legs wrapped in fleece that never moved. His hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair too tightly for someone with no strength in them. He stared at the ground, then slowly, almost reluctantly, looked up, and his eyes locked with Kiara's. Something inside her snapped. Not in panic, not in fear. It was the opposite of emptiness. It was knowing. The same knowing she felt once when she pressed her palms to her mother's ribs and whispered lullabies through tears, even though the ambulance never came. The boy's eyes were like glass, thick and immobile, but behind them was a scream. Kiara stepped back, heart racing. The guards hadn't seen her yet. She crouched, ducking into shadow, but her breath came fast. Her grandmother's voice rang through her memory. Some are born to run, some are born to feel, You were born to remember." She didn't sleep that night. The notebook lay open in her lap as she sat under the skeletal remains of a playground slide, turning phrases over and over. By morning, she knew what she had to do. On the fourth day of frost, Kiara made her way to the corner of West Elm and Grand, where the Wakefield estate stood behind walls of pale stone and glass. The mansion was part fortress, part monument, set back behind iron gates tall enough to block out the sky. Guards in black coats monitored everyone who passed by. A small group of protesters had gathered across the street, shouting something about drug patents. Kiara ignored them. She had her own mission. She found a piece of cardboard in a recycling bin and used her pencil to write in bold letters, "I can help your son." Then she stood near the gate, small and still, holding the sign like a prayer. People walked past without looking. A woman in a fur coat wrinkled her nose and crossed to the other side. A man in a tailored blazer tossed a $5 bill at her feet without slowing down. Kiara didn't move. By late afternoon, a black SUV pulled up to the estate. Kiara's heart stuttered. Through the tinted glass, she caught a glimpse of the same boy from before, hunched in the back seat, eyes vacant. The car rolled past without pause. One of the guards noticed her and strode forward, his footsteps heavy. "What are you doing here?" he barked. His eyes swept her from head to toe, lingering on the holes in her coat sleeves. "I want to help," Kiara said quietly, lifting the sign. He scoffed. "Go help yourself to a shelter. Beat it." She didn't budge. "You deaf or stupid?" He reached for her arm. Kiara jerked away and ran, ducking between the pedestrians, her sign trailing behind her. The guard didn't bother chasing her. He muttered something under his breath, something about crazy street rats and needing a damn city sweep. Kiara hid in an alley until dusk fell. She wasn't crying. Her grandmother taught her never to cry where men could see. Instead, she whispered under her breath, eyes closed, "He is locked, but I have the key." The next day she returned. This time she didn't hold the sign. She simply stood, eyes locked on the gate, and the next day, and the one after that. People began to notice. Someone posted her photo on social media. "This little witch says she can heal the Wakefield kid. LMFAO." It went viral. Kiara's face was turned into a meme. The healer of Wall Street. Psychic panhandler. Some laughed, others mocked. A few called it disturbing. No one took it seriously. But she stayed. By the end of the week, a staff member from the Wakefield house approached her. A woman in an ivory coat, severe bun, and polished boots. Her name was Mrs. Green. She didn't smile. "You're scaring the boy," she said bluntly. "He saw you in a video. It upset him. You're to leave and not return." Kiara looked her in the eyes and said nothing. "Do you understand?" the woman pressed. "Mr. Wakefield has important responsibilities. He won't be wasting time on delusions." Kiara turned and walked away, but not far. She slept under the eaves of a bookstore that night, listening to the patter of snow against the awning. Her notebook rested against her heart. The words inside vibrated in her bones. Somewhere inside that glass mansion was a boy who couldn't walk, couldn't smile, and couldn't be reached by any of the millions spent on him. But Kiara wasn't offering medicine. She was offering something rarer, something no one else seemed to see. She was offering hope. And even if they spat at her, mocked her, or dragged her away, she would offer it again, and again, and again. The frost had deepened by the following morning, painting the windows of the Wakefield estate with delicate filigrees of white, like nature's attempt to soften the glass walls of the modern palace. Inside, the air was warm and perfumed with sandalwood and citrus. The housekeepers moved quietly, their shoes soundless on the imported marble, their glances cast downward with the practiced discretion of servants well paid to disappear into the background. But silence did not mean peace. It never had in this place. Upstairs, in the third-floor west wing, Lucas Wakefield sat beneath a blanket of Peruvian alpaca wool, unmoving. His legs were covered, though he had long ceased to feel the difference. Around him, the room was more a gallery than a boy's chamber, walls lined with abstract paintings, bookshelves filled with untouched volumes, and a state-of-the-art gaming system gathering dust beneath a television larger than the bed he slept in. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the faint scratches on the glass, the faintest imperfections in an otherwise pristine world. Lucas stared at the view blankly, chin resting on a hand too limp to support it. His wheelchair had been parked near the window earlier that morning by an aide who no longer tried to engage him in conversation. The boy had not spoken more than a few words since the accident 9 months ago, and the therapist had stopped pretending they could coax him out of silence. He was a statue now, carved from pain, positioned each day for optimal exposure to vitamin D, and monitored with silent hope. Outside, past the manicured lawn and heated driveway, a black town car pulled to a stop beneath the front portico. Ronald Wakefield stepped out, his tailored coat cutting sharply against the snow-dusted steps. His silver hair, combed back with precise effortlessness, caught the low winter sun, giving him the air of a man perpetually illuminated by his own importance. His assistant trailed behind, rattling off numbers, names, meetings, but Ronald's attention had long since drifted. He paused before entering the house, his eyes drifting upward to the window where his son sat. From this distance, Lucas looked like a shadow behind the glass, unmoving, unreadable. A pang, not quite sorrow and not quite fear, passed through Ronald's chest like a chill. Then he turned and disappeared inside. Later that evening, the estate buzzed with preparation. A gala was scheduled, a charity fundraiser under the guise of scientific advancement. Politicians, celebrities, and pharmaceutical investors were all on the guest list. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished silver, deals would be struck over foie gras and fine wine. Wakefield Pharmaceuticals prided itself on being the face of modern medicine, and Ronald, as its patriarch, wore that face with pride. Lucas was not invited. He remained upstairs, as he always did, dressed in silence, bathed and brushed by invisible hands. His father hadn't visited him in days, not out of malice, but out of fear, the kind that builds in the hearts of men who believe themselves powerful until they are reminded of all they cannot fix. Ronald did not do well with reminders. As the hour of the gala approached, the house transformed. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms lined the halls. Musicians tuned their instruments in the east atrium. Crystal centerpieces glimmered beneath golden light. Guests began arriving in coats of velvet and fur, each more elaborately dressed than the last. They sipped from fluted glasses and spoke in low, cultivated voices, discussing research funding and medical patents as if they were gossip over coffee. No one noticed the girl slipping through the kitchen door. Kiara's coat hung loosely around her, soaked at the hems with melted snow. Her eyes, however, were sharp. She had waited 3 nights for this moment, studied the servant schedules, followed the rhythm of deliveries. She moved like a shadow behind the catering carts, her breath caught between terror and certainty. The hallway before her pulsed with muffled violin music. Up ahead, the ballroom shimmered with light. Kiara clutched the frayed strap of her backpack where her notebook lay hidden. This was not madness. This was mission. She stepped into the room. It happened in an instant. One moment, the music soared, laughter rising like steam, and then silence. Heads turned, wine glasses hovered in midair. A girl stood on the marble floor, dirty boots soaking the pristine carpet, face framed by wild curls, eyes wide but unafraid. A collective breath was held. Kiara looked directly at Ronald Wakefield, the man who had ignored her, the man whose son sat behind glass. She took a step forward, and her voice, though small, cut through the silence like a blade. "I can help your son." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They landed like a tremor. Gasps scattered through the room. A guest dropped her clutch. Another took out his phone. Ronald's face changed. His jaw tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening. For a moment, he looked almost human, staggered by something he didn't understand. Then the steel returned. "Get her out of here," he said. Two guards emerged from the side doors and grabbed her by the arms. Kiara didn't fight. Her feet barely touched the floor as they dragged her through the crowd. But she turned her head, locking eyes with Ronald one more time. "He needs more than medicine," she said. "He needs someone who sees him." The guards shoved her through the door. It slammed behind her with a heavy finality. Inside, the gala resumed. Music returned, though half-heartedly. Conversations stuttered, then resumed with forced brightness. Ronald remained still, his hands clenched at his sides. A waiter approached him with a drink, which he waved away without a glance. Upstairs, Lucas had watched it all from the security feed in his room. One of the few privileges he retained was the ability to flip through camera angles of the house. He had seen her, the girl, the same one from outside, the same one who didn't look at him with pity or polished sympathy, but with something else, something fierce. He rewound the footage, watching her step into the ballroom again and again. Her voice echoed in his mind. "I can help your son." Downstairs, Ronald retreated to his office. The party could run itself. He poured a drink, 2 fingers of scotch, no ice, and stared at the flames flickering behind the fireplace screen. The fire reminded him of control, of power, of something he once believed he possessed. He thought of Lucas, of the long, sterile hospital corridors, the specialists flown in from Zurich, the machines that blinked but never healed. He thought of how small his son had become, how silent. He thought of the girl. Ronald had dismissed her, publicly, decisively, but she hadn't looked like a liar. She had looked like someone who believed she had something to offer, and somehow that belief had lodged itself into his mind like a splinter. He poured another drink and sat in the dark. The next morning, a new wave of articles flooded the business feeds. "Wakefield security breach," read one headline. "Unhoused child crashes elite gala," read another. The photograph was everywhere, Kiara's face defiant and wild, her small frame surrounded by silk and suits. Ronald's PR team went into overdrive. Apologies were issued, legal threats were drafted, but the damage had been done. Inside the walls of the mansion, Lucas asked to be left alone. He watched the footage again. He scrolled through the news. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It didn't last long, but it was the first real one in months. Outside in the alley behind the bookstore, Kiara read the same articles. Her name wasn't printed. No one had bothered to ask it, but her image was etched across the world. Some said she was delusional. Others called her dangerous. A few, only a few, asked if she might be telling the truth. She tucked the notebook into her coat and sat quietly as the city howled around her. This wasn't over. Ronald Wakefield sat in his office late that night, staring at his reflection in the black screen of a powered-down monitor. He had built an empire of reason, of science, of results. He didn't believe in mysticism or miracles. And yet, he couldn't forget the way she had looked at him. As though, for once, he wasn't the one with all the answers. The nights had grown longer, as though the city itself conspired to stretch the darkness, drawing it over rooftops and alleyways like a funeral veil. Beneath the humming neon of a 24-hour laundromat, Kiara crouched behind a dumpster, her back pressed against the brick wall that radiated a fading memory of heat. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The stale sandwich crust she'd salvaged from a plastic bag behind the bakery had gone to a pair of toddlers huddled beneath a train overpass. She watched them eat in silence, remembering the way her grandmother used to tear bread in half and whisper, "What we give, we keep." Her fingers were stiff with cold, but she didn't complain. Complaints were for those who expected something better. Kiara expected nothing. And yet, somewhere deep beneath her ribs, something flickered, a whisper, a weightless ember of purpose that had not gone out, even after humiliation, even after the guards had shoved her onto the pavement and the crowd had laughed. She clutched her notebook tighter to her chest and rested her head on her knees. The words inside weren't spells. They were reminders, truths wrapped in memories. Some wounds are deeper than bone. Some pain grows roots. But even the deepest ache will answer to love that doesn't flinch. That was her grandmother's wisdom. Her grandmother, who had died in a shelter bed because the hospital turned them away. Because they thought a black woman who spoke of healing through breath and thought and energy was a lunatic. Because she didn't have insurance. Now, Kiara was alone. But the boy in the chair, he was alone too. She'd seen it in his eyes. Not just pain, loneliness, that invisible kind that eats from the inside out. Across the city, in a bedroom built of money and isolation, Lucas stared at the ceiling. The light was off, but he didn't need it. He knew every contour of this ceiling, every flicker of the city light that seeped through the heavy drapes. He lay awake, remembering the girl. Not because she had stormed into a party or caused a scandal. No, it wasn't the drama that clung to her memory. It was her stillness. She hadn't trembled, not even when they dragged her out. And when she looked at him, through that camera lens, through the footage he had watched over and over, she had looked like she knew him. Not the version of him on pamphlets, not the tragedy the doctors dissected with charts, but him. The boy still buried under all the broken. He closed his eyes. His legs tingled. Not the phantom kind that the doctors said he might feel, but something else, like his muscles had heard her voice and were remembering. Downstairs, Ronald stood in his office, back to the fire, arms crossed as he watched the storm coil through the city. The press had not relented. Reporters camped near the gates. The internet fed itself on the image of the girl. The board had called 3 emergency meetings in 48 hours. And yet, none of it seemed real. What felt real was the way Lucas had smiled. Ronald had watched it on the security feed. The boy had leaned forward, studying the grainy image of the girl as she stood alone in a ballroom full of disgusted elites. And then, as if something vital had shifted, his lips had curled slightly at the edges. The footage had played in Ronald's mind like a loop. It was the first time his son had reacted to anything that wasn't medical torture or soul-numbing therapy, and still he hadn't moved, hadn't gone to Lucas's room, hadn't spoken to him. The shame of that sat in Ronald's stomach like lead. What kind of father needs permission to face his own child? That night, He couldn't sleep. The scotch did nothing. The silence of the estate felt louder than any news cycle, and so, without alerting his driver, without informing security, Ronald took his coat and keys and stepped into the freezing night. He didn't know where she was. He barely knew her name, but he remembered the bookstore she had retreated behind when the tabloids first broke. He remembered the street, narrow and cracked, with gutters that overflowed in the rain and windows lined with soot. He remembered because when he'd passed that alley once before in the back seat of his car, he had turned his head away. Now, he parked 3 blocks down and walked. The pavement was slick with ice. The city smelled of car exhaust, burnt sugar, and something rotten. A man like him didn't belong here. His coat cost more than most apartments on this street, but for the first time in years he didn't care. He found her curled beside a heating grate, wrapped in her coat, one shoe missing, the other held together with duct tape. She looked smaller in the dark, younger, but when her eyes opened and met his, there was no fear, only quiet readiness. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He lowered himself to the ground beside her, the concrete stealing warmth from his legs immediately. He hadn't sat on the ground since college. The indignity of it would have horrified him once. Now it felt like confession. He opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat. Kiara waited. Finally, he pulled something from his pocket. A photograph. Lucas, aged 7, laughing beside a pony at some long-forgotten fundraiser. Ronald didn't say what it meant. He didn't have to. "I saw you on the feed," Kiara said quietly. "You watched her drag me out, but you didn't look away." His mouth was dry. "No?" She nodded as if she already knew. "I need to understand," he said at last. "Why do you think you can help him?" "Because I know what it's like to be frozen," she replied. "To be there, but not really. To be invisible. I see it in him. His body might be broken, but it's not the only thing that needs healing." "And you can fix that?" "No," she said simply, "but I can help him remember how to try." He reached for his wallet, hesitated, then pulled out several crisp $100 bills. He held them out to her. She didn't move. "I don't want your money," she said softly. "I want to help." His hand trembled, then lowered. The bills fell to the pavement between them, forgotten. "Tell me what you need," he said. "A chance." And just like that, the scales tipped. They drove in silence. She sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, chin lifted, as though daring the leather upholstery to make her feel small. Ronald kept glancing at her, this girl who had no home, no name in the system, no protection. And yet, she carried herself like someone who had something more valuable than all of it: purpose. They arrived at the estate before dawn. The guards were startled but did not question their employer. Ronald led her through the servants' corridor, past kitchens still dark and hallways lined with sleeping light. In his private study, he turned to her. "You said you're not a doctor. So what are you?" She shrugged. "A listener, a mirror. My grandmother called it knowing." He stared at her, the arrogance of it, and yet her eyes did not lie. "You said someone taught you." "Don Cornelio. He used to walk through the neighborhoods in the South District. He'd stop and touch people's shoulders, talk to them about breath, about stillness. They called him crazy, but he saved more lives than the clinics did." Ronald exhaled. His chest ached. He looked at her, really looked. Not as a CEO, not as a father buying solutions, but as a man who had run out of answers. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll meet Lucas." Kiara nodded. As he left her in the guest room, Ronald paused outside the door. The air smelled of dust and lavender. For the first time in what felt like years, he didn't dread the morning. Upstairs, Lucas stirred in his sleep. In his dream, someone held his hand, not to guide, not to force, but to remind. He couldn't see her face, but her voice was warm and the words didn't scare him. "You're still in there," she said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Wakefield estate with a muted dignity, falling across polished floors and trimmed hedges outside where the frost had only just begun to melt. Inside, the house stirred to life with the soundless rhythm of staff who had long ago mastered the art of invisibility. Breakfast was being prepared, uniforms steamed, newspapers delivered to the study with robotic precision. But there was one ripple in the perfection, a presence that didn't belong and had never been meant to step past the gates. Kiara sat upright in the narrow bed of the guest room, eyes wide open, posture alert despite the softness of the downy blanket wrapped around her. She had not slept, though her body begged for it. Sleep was dangerous when you had something to lose, and for the first time in a long while, she did. The room was foreign in every way, cream-colored wallpaper, heavy velvet curtains, gilded furniture, but she refused to be intimidated. She was used to being unwelcome. She was used to silence being sharper than words. She glanced down at her lap where her grandmother's notebook rested open. Its pages were smudged, dog-eared, almost illegible in places, but to her it was scripture. She traced a line with her finger, whispering to herself, "The wound that is not seen is the one that festers deepest." She read it again, this time more slowly. The words were not instruction. They were orientation. They reminded her who she was. Downstairs, Ronald Wakefield stood before the wide windows of his study, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He had told no one, no staff, no advisors, no doctors. The girl was here, in his house. The consequences of that decision had yet to manifest, but he felt the pressure already building, like a fault line cracking beneath polished floors. He didn't know why he had brought her. Or rather, he did, but couldn't say it aloud. There had been a moment, sitting beside her in the dark alley, when something inside him had shifted. Not cracked, but bent. It was the first time he had followed something other than logic. It was the first time he had listened to a voice other than his own. He turned from the window as footsteps approached. The housekeeper, Mrs. Green, appeared in the doorway holding a clipboard and wearing the same expression she had worn for 20 years. Professional, guarded, mildly disapproving. "Sir, the girl, she's awake." "I assumed she would be," Ronald replied. "You haven't given us any instructions." "That's because I'm not asking you to do anything." She hesitated. "Should I inform Dr. Kinley?" "No." Mrs. Green stiffened. "Very well." She left without argument, but Ronald caught the flicker of judgment in her eyes. She thought he was mad. They all would, soon enough. But he didn't care. He had watched his son fade behind glass, and if the world's finest minds hadn't been able to reach him, maybe the solution wasn't in the world they knew. He went upstairs himself. Not to Lucas's room, not yet. First, to the guest room. He knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Kiara was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her backpack at her feet. "I'm ready," she said. Ronald studied her. Her posture was rigid, but not tense. Her eyes were bright, but not eager. She wasn't here to beg or impress. She was here to do what she believed needed doing. He nodded. "Follow me." They moved through the house without speaking. Kiara walked with silent steps, scanning everything. The layout, the staff's reactions, the rooms. She read spaces the way other people read faces. Every hallway told her something. Every painting, every scent. By the time they reached the West Wing, she already understood more about this household than anyone had meant for her to. Ronald stopped before a closed door. He may not talk to you. He may not even look at you. Kiara nodded once. He opened the door. Lucas was by the window, as always, his wheelchair angled toward the view but not quite centered. The morning sun lit the side of his face, revealing the curve of his jaw, the line of tension at his brow. He didn't turn as they entered. Ronald cleared his throat. "Lucas, there's someone I'd like you to meet." No response. Kiara stepped forward. Ronald began to speak again, but she raised a hand. Not rudely, not firmly, but with a quiet insistence that stopped him mid-sentence. He watched as she moved across the room, slowly, deliberately, until she was just a few feet from the boy. She didn't speak. She didn't kneel. She just stood there, letting the silence grow. Lucas turned his head slightly, just enough to see her from the corner of his eye. Then she sat down. They faced the window together, two figures bathed in pale light, not looking at each other, not speaking, but something passed between them, an unspoken recognition. Ronald felt it like static on his skin. After a few minutes, Kiara reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She placed it on her lap and opened it, not reading aloud, just letting it lie there. "Your son's healing," she said quietly without turning. "It won't come from machines or pills. It will come from within." Ronald remained in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. "I need time," Kiara said, still facing the window. He hesitated. Then he stepped out and closed the door behind him. The reaction in the house was immediate. Mrs. Green approached him an hour later with a report. Staff had noticed the girl was alone with the boy. The medical team was uneasy. One of the therapists had sent a warning to Dr. Kinley. The security chief asked if he should be on alert. Ronald silenced them all, but the murmurs continued. In the lunchroom, in the laundry quarters, in the chauffeur's lounge, they had all seen the video. They all had opinions. She was a fraud, a vagrant, a dangerous child manipulating grief. And now she was inside the fortress. That night, Lucas requested dinner in his room. That hadn't happened in months. The next morning, Kiara returned. She brought a deck of old playing cards with missing corners and stains. She dealt a game of solitaire on the floor and played without saying a word. Lucas watched from his chair, eyes flicking between her fingers and the cards. Eventually, he said, "You play wrong." Kiara looked up. "Maybe, but it keeps me sharp." Lucas said nothing else, but the next day he asked if she knew how to play chess. By the end of the week, they had a routine. Kiara arrived after breakfast, sat with Lucas until lunch, and returned again before dinner. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Once, she touched his arm, lightly, as if testing. He didn't pull away. Ronald watched all of it from the hallway camera feeds. He told no one. Not yet. It was the 8th day when Lucas said something unexpected. He was watching Kiara draw something on a sheet of paper, something abstract, a swirl of lines and shadows, and he asked, "Do you think broken things can still be useful?" She looked at him not as a patient, not as a child, as a person. Sometimes broken things see more clearly. He turned back to the window. Ronald met with his board that evening. They grilled him on stock instability, press narratives, liability risks. He nodded, answered questions, reassured them that he had everything under control. But inside, he knew it wasn't about control anymore. It was about choosing a different kind of path. When he returned home, Kiara was leaving Lucas's room. She saw him and paused. "He laughed today," she said. "Once." Ronald felt the weight of those words. They were small, but they meant more than any quarterly report. Kiara didn't wait for praise. She walked past him, silent and sure. That night, Ronald stood outside Lucas's door, hand raised to knock, but he didn't. Inside, Lucas was asleep. In his dream, he was standing, not running, not leaping, just standing, on grass that breathed beneath his feet. The sky above him was full of movement and color, and a voice was telling him, "You don't have to go back to who you were. You just have to go forward." The house was still, but something inside it had begun to move. The first sign came just after noon, as snow flurries drifted lazily past the tall windows of Lucas's room, and the warm hum of the fireplace filled the silence between words. Kiara was seated cross-legged on the floor, her fingers tracing a line through the thick fibers of the rug, while Lucas remained in his wheelchair, angled toward her, a chessboard between them. They had played for nearly an hour, neither of them particularly focused on the outcome. The pieces moved with the rhythm of habit more than strategy, but that wasn't the point. Lucas hadn't asked about victory in weeks. He had learned to value the playing itself. His hand hovered near a pawn, fingers twitching slightly, and then paused. He winced, not from pain, but from something deeper, a familiar dread beginning to surface. It was the same feeling that had paralyzed him so many times before, when a movement, even the smallest, threatened to unearth the grief he had worked so hard to bury. Kiara sensed it before he could speak. "Try the bishop," she said gently, not looking up. Lucas swallowed. His hand moved again. The bishop slid forward. "That was better," she said. "I didn't mean to move it, but you did." He didn't reply. His eyes flicked toward the fireplace, watching the flames, searching for something in their shape. Kiara rose slowly, stepped beside him, and crouched. She didn't touch him, never unless invited, but she let her presence speak for her. Lucas felt it, that steady warmth, that refusal to vanish when things got hard. That was new. Everyone else, nurses, therapists, even his father, had retreated behind masks when his body didn't obey them. "I feel something," he said quietly, almost ashamed. "Like buzzing." Kiara tilted her head. "Where?" "My toes." She waited. "What kind of buzzing?" "Like when your foot falls asleep, like bees. It's small, but it's there." She nodded once. "Good. You don't think I'm imagining it?" "I think your body is waking up." Lucas closed his eyes. His fingers tightened slightly on the wheelchair's armrests. What if it's just false hope? Kiara stood. Her voice was low but steady. Hope doesn't have to be false or true. It just has to be yours. That night, Ronald didn't watch the cameras. He went to Lucas's room for the first time in over a week, unsure of what he expected to find. He had prepared himself for rejection, for cold glances and clipped answers, but when he entered, he found Lucas asleep, his hand resting on Kiara's notebook, which lay open on his lap. He stood in the doorway for a long time, uncertain whether to speak or retreat. Kiara was seated in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes tired but peaceful. "He said he felt something," she whispered. "His toes." Ronald stepped further in. "And you believe him?" "I do." He looked at the boy, his face still in sleep, his expression softer than he had seen in months. Then he looked at the girl the media still called a fraud, a distraction, a danger. "I believe him too," Ronald said, barely above a whisper, but the world beyond the estate's walls did not. The following morning, the headlines exploded. "Wakefield heir being treated by unlicensed child mystic, blared one. Ronald Wakefield's spiritual meltdown, read another. A photograph of Kiara stepping out of the back entrance of the estate was plastered across every major tabloid. Speculations ran wild. Some questioned her identity. Others dissected Ronald's mental deterioration. Investors panicked. Wakefield stock dropped 6% in a single day. Inside the house, chaos bloomed. Ronald was called into an emergency board meeting. His assistants pounded on his office door, phones ringing off the hook. Reporters camped outside the gates, shouting questions at staff and deliveries alike. He ignored them all. When he finally appeared in the boardroom, a sleek, sterile place of steel and glass overlooking the city, he looked every inch the titan he had always been. Impeccable suit, measured posture. But something in his eyes had changed. "This is absurd," one of the board members snapped. "You've allowed an unknown child with no medical background to work with your son." "She's not working with him," Ronald said calmly. "She's helping him." "Do you even hear yourself?" snapped another. "This could destroy us. Do you realize what kind of liability we're talking about?" "She's not a liability. She's a child." "So is my son," Ronald said, his voice dropping. "A child everyone else had given up on." Silence. The room stilled. "You're compromising everything we've built." "No," he said, "I'm redefining it." There were arguments, threats. One partner stormed out. But Ronald didn't flinch. He knew what he was choosing, and for once he knew that it was the right thing. Not for the company, not for the shareholders, but for Lucas. That evening, he returned home to find Lucas in the garden. The wheelchair sat beside the edge of the stone path, and Lucas was on the grass, propped against a tree, breathing hard, sweat beading his forehead. Kiara knelt beside him, one hand near his shoulder, not touching, simply anchoring him. Ronald froze. Lucas was on the ground, not slumped, not dragged, sitting on his own. "I wanted to feel it," Lucas gasped. "The earth under my legs." Kiara met Ronald's gaze. Her eyes said everything. Lucas wasn't cured. His body was still fragile, his legs trembling with even the idea of movement. But he was trying. That night, after Kiara had gone to her room and Lucas had been helped to bed, Ronald returned to his study and stared at the photograph of his wife. She had died years before, but her voice still lingered in the walls. She had been softer than him, quieter, but braver in a different way. She had believed in the intangible, and now, somehow, her absence had led him to this moment. He whispered to the photo, "He's fighting again," and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The next morning, Lucas asked to be taken outside again. This time, he held the back of the bench with trembling fingers and stood. Not for long, not steadily, but he stood. By the end of the week, he could take 2 steps, gripping Kiara's hand. By the end of the month, he walked 6. The world continued to mock. The press called it a PR stunt. Experts wrote op-eds dismissing the miracle. Commentators debated child exploitation. But inside the house, the truth lived in every footprint Lucas left behind. Kiara watched from the sidelines, never claiming credit, never asking for more than time. One night, as they sat by the fire, Lucas said, "Do you think I'll ever run again?" Kiara smiled. "I think you'll fly." He didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. The frost had lifted. It wasn't quite spring yet, but something in the air had changed. The mornings, though still cold, no longer bit through the skin with cruel precision. The sky had softened, and so had the soil. In the gardens behind the Wakefield estate, Tender green sprouts pushed through patches of thawing earth, small and almost invisible, but determined. They arrived with no announcement, no fanfare, only the slow persistence of life where everyone had long since stopped looking for it. Lucas had reached the point of standing without assistance. His legs, though thin and often trembling, now answered when he called. The distance between his bed and the window no longer seemed infinite. He moved slowly, deliberately, with every step a quiet rebellion against the months that had claimed him. The medical staff still couldn't explain it. The therapists, whose clinical vocabulary once stretched endlessly across notepads and voice memos, now fell back on a single word: unexpected. But it wasn't unexpected to Kiara. To her, it was the natural result of being seen, being held in someone's gaze without judgment or calculation. Lucas had not only been paralyzed in body, he had been paralyzed in belief, in hope, in the very idea that anything in his life could be reclaimed. Kiara had never promised him a miracle. She had only promised to stay. And she had. Each day she greeted him not with clinical instructions, but with a steady, grounding presence. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes they painted or listened to music or watched clouds from the stone bench near the conservatory. And sometimes, without warning, Lucas would reach for her hand, not for balance, but for affirmation. And she would offer it without hesitation. Ronald had become a different man in those same days, not all at once, not in dramatic gestures, but gradually, like ice receding from the edge of a lake. He no longer lived by his calendar alone. He no longer entered rooms with the weight of meeting still clinging to his shoulders. More and more, he made time to sit in silence with his son, to ask how he was without expecting an answer, to learn the value of simply being present. He began helping Lucas into the garden in the mornings, guiding him down the shallow steps to the grass, listening when the boy described the texture of bark or the warmth of stone. There were moments when Ronald caught glimpses of the boy he had feared he'd lost forever. The curiosity, the sharp wit, the spark. It hadn't died. It had gone into hiding. One afternoon, Lucas looked up from a book and asked, without warning, "Why don't you ever talk about Mom?" Ronald had frozen. His hands stilled on the teacup, his breath caught. "I didn't know if you wanted to," he finally said. "I do," Lucas replied. "I think about her every day." Ronald nodded slowly. "So do I." From that moment, the wall between them began to crack, not with violence, but with honesty. The grief that had driven them apart now became a bridge. They spoke of her often, her laugh, her garden, the way she used to hum when slicing apples. Kiara listened quietly when they spoke, not intruding, not retreating. Her presence became something sacred in those conversations, the space where healing was allowed to take root. And then came the question Ronald had not anticipated. "I want her to be part of this family," Lucas said one evening. Ronald looked up from the chessboard. "Who?" "Kiara." Ronald studied his son's face. There was no hesitation, no playfulness, only a quiet certainty. "She already is," he said. "No," Lucas said, shaking his head. "I mean, really, I want you to adopt her." Ronald didn't respond right away. He stared at the fire for a long time. The idea, once unthinkable, no longer felt foreign. He had already given her the keys to the house, the right to speak without fear, the authority to touch the most vulnerable part of his life. What was a name compared to that? He found her in the garden later that evening, seated cross-legged beneath the dogwood tree, notebook in hand, writing in long, looping strokes. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. She looked up. Her expression was unreadable, as always. I want to adopt you." Kiara blinked. For the first time since he had met her, she seemed uncertain. "You don't have to answer now," he said, "or ever. I know this place was never meant to be yours. I know the world hasn't exactly given you reasons to trust what's offered freely. But I want you to know you are wanted. Here, in this family. Not because of what you've done, but because of who you are." For a long time she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "I'd like that." The process moved quickly. Ronald Wakefield was not a man who encountered red tape for long. His lawyers were discreet. The paperwork was signed within weeks. The news, when it reached the public, ignited another wave of controversy. Speculation flooded the media. Theories abounded. Was this a publicity stunt, a distraction, a transaction? But Ronald didn't grant interviews. He didn't clarify, justify, or explain. He didn't need to. He only needed to watch his son lift himself from a chair, walk across the lawn, and hug the girl who had changed everything. They held a quiet celebration on a Sunday afternoon. Just the three of them. Lucas insisted on making the toast himself. He stood behind the small table in the garden, a glass of lemonade in one hand, the other gripping the edge for balance. "This is my sister," he said. "She didn't have to save me. She didn't have to stay, but she did. And now I get to live a life I thought I lost. I'll never be able to repay her, but I can promise this. I'll walk with her now, wherever she goes." Ronald raised his glass, unable to speak. His eyes were too full. That night, as dusk rolled across the sky and the house settled into quiet, Kiara stood at the window of her new room. It wasn't the size or the softness of the bed that moved her. It was the books on the shelves, the drawings Lucas had made for her, the space carved out with care and permanence. For the first time in her life, she unpacked everything she owned. The notebook went on the nightstand. The next morning, Ronald found her seated on the kitchen stool, helping the cook slice strawberries. She laughed at something Lucas said and leaned against the counter like she belonged there, because now she did. Later that week, they went together to the district courthouse, where the judge finalized the adoption. The man in the robes smiled down at her, his voice warm. "Do you accept Ronald Wakefield as your legal guardian and father?" She nodded. "Yes." "And do you accept Kiara?" "She's my daughter," Ronald interrupted, his voice steady. "Always has been. This just makes it official." The judge signed the papers. Cameras clicked outside. Reporters shouted. Inside, Kiara held the folder with her new name inside it. She whispered to herself, "I exist." That night, she wrote a new line in her grandmother's notebook. "Even the soil they tried to bury me in was rich enough to grow a forest." She closed the book and turned off the light. In the quiet that followed, the whole house breathed as one. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the sharp bite of winter, nor the reluctant warmth of early spring. It was softer now, round at the edges, brushed with the promise of something blooming just out of sight. The trees surrounding the Wakefield estate had begun to wear a faint shimmer of green, not yet leaves, but the preparation of them. The grounds, once frozen and silent, now sang with small life. Sparrows in the hedges, bees in the blossoms, the murmur of newness rising through the soil. But inside the house, the most profound changes had already taken root. Lucas now walked unaided for short distances. He still used the wheelchair for longer days, still trembled when tired, but he was moving, not just physically, but emotionally, inwardly, with a growing confidence that came not from therapy or clinical intervention, but from trust. His steps, tentative at first, had grown steadier, and his eyes, once dulled by the weight of despair, now sparkled with something fierce and bright. He was living again, and everyone who saw him knew it, even if few could explain it. The Wakefield estate had transformed with him. The halls that once echoed only with the polite murmurs of staff now rang with music, laughter, and conversation. Ronald had taken to cooking breakfast on Sundays, burning eggs more often than not, but refusing to let the chef intervene. Lucas played the piano again, his fingers clumsy but determined. And Kiara. Kiara had found her rhythm within the house as though she had always been meant to be there. She had gone from guest to guardian in the space of weeks, not by force, but by presence. Wherever she walked, something changed. Not because she demanded it, but because she reminded people of something they had forgotten. Ronald watched her often from the study window, where he now spent less and less time. She moved through the garden with her notebook under one arm, sometimes stopping to write, sometimes simply standing with her face tilted to the sun. She was still quiet, still observant, still carrying the weight of memories no one could name. But there was a lightness in her now, a grace that came from being held, not as a burden, but as a gift. The foundation began almost by accident. It started with a letter. A woman from the city's south side wrote to the estate. She had seen Kiara's story in a magazine, one of the few that had chosen to report it not as a scandal, but as a miracle. Her daughter had been injured in a car crash 6 months prior. The doctors had said she would never walk again, but the mother had seen a photograph of Lucas standing beside Kiara, and she dared to hope. She didn't ask for money, she asked for a visit. Ronald brought the letter to Kiara that evening. She read it 3 times before speaking. "I want to go," she said. They traveled together 2 days later. Lucas insisted on coming, and Ronald didn't argue. The girl's name was Elena. She was 10, with dark hair and eyes like glass, and she barely looked up when Kiara entered the room. Her mother hovered in the doorway, anxious, hopeful, afraid. Kiara sat beside the girl, opened her notebook, and began to read. She didn't touch Elena. She didn't offer false promises. She only spoke to her, gently, about pain, about stillness, about how sometimes the world tries to tell your body it's broken when really it's just waiting to be heard. Elena didn't speak, but she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just a single tear sliding down her cheek like the melting of a stone. Kiara smiled and whispered, "That's the beginning." Word spread faster than they imagined. By the end of the month, 5 more letters arrived, then 12, then over 100. They came from across the country. Parents, grandparents, teachers, even children writing in crayon. Some wanted help, some wanted hope. Some simply wanted to say thank you. Ronald called a meeting. "This can't stay small," he said. "It matters too much." And so they began the Kiara Foundation. The mission was simple: to offer emotional healing and community support to children living with physical trauma. It wasn't a clinic. It wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. It was human connection, access to mentorship, and spaces where healing was defined not by charts, but by trust. Ronald funded it without hesitation. Lucas served as its first youth advocate, and Kiara became its heart. They converted one of the Wakefield properties into a retreat center, not a sterile building, but a living space filled with color, light, gardens, music, and art. Children came with casts, braces, scars, and wheelchairs. They left with laughter, with memory, with the understanding that they were seen. Some walked again, some didn't, but all were changed. Kiara worked without title. She met every child at eye level, never above. She didn't promise recovery. She promised presence. That was enough. Reporters came, documentaries were made, awards followed, but fame never changed her. She never moved into a mansion. She never bought designer clothes. She wore the same jacket, kept the same notebook, and carried the same voice that had once whispered through alleyways and subway stations. One morning, Ronald found her in the garden, reading aloud to a group of children. Her voice was calm, steady. The sun had just broken through the trees, casting gold across their faces. He stood silently, overwhelmed. She looked up, met his eyes, and smiled. That night, Lucas sat beside Kiara in her room. They were older now, both taller, stronger, more certain, but the bond between them had never changed. "Do you think this will last?" he asked. She closed her notebook. "Yes," she said, "because it's not mine. It belongs to everyone who believes." Lucas nodded. "And what about you? What do you want now?" She thought for a long time. "To keep walking," she said, "wherever the path leads." A month later, she received a letter postmarked from her old neighborhood. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was familiar, curved and trembling. Inside was a single sentence. "You have done what I couldn't." It was from her grandmother's old friend, Don Cornelio, perhaps, or someone who had known her legacy. Kiara pressed the letter to her chest and wept. In time, the Kiara Foundation expanded. Chapters opened in other cities, other countries. Ronald stepped back from business entirely, devoting himself to mentorship and advocacy. Lucas began training as a therapist. He walked unaided now, ran occasionally, and had become a gifted public speaker. At every major event, he introduced himself the same way. "My name is Lucas Wakefield. I was broken, but someone showed me how to be whole again." Years passed. The estate remained, though it changed with time. The garden grew wild in places. The old conservatory became a studio. The bench under the dogwood tree was worn smooth from use. And Kiara remained at the center of it all. Not as a figurehead, not as a saint, but as a reminder that even the forgotten can be found, that even the broken can heal, that even a whisper in the dark can grow into something loud enough to change the world. And that hope, quiet, persistent, unreasonable hope, is the most powerful legacy of all. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch more videos on the channel for stories that stay with you. And if you know someone who needs a little hope today, share this video with them.